If there ever was a way to kick the proverbial hornet's nest in model railroading, this question would certainly do it. Which one should I pick, N or HO scale? We're going to talk about that on Coffee and Trains. Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Trains. Before we begin, I am drinking Community's coffee and chicory, and as always, black with 2 sugars. Alright, so before we begin, I just want to say that I do love both N and HO scale, and I don't think one is truly better than the other because they're model trains and each scale has its own merits and drawbacks, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today because I have modeled both N and HO scale extensively. So I want to talk about 3 plus sides for picking N or HO scale and 3 drawbacks for picking N or HO scale. So let's get started. Let's start with the slightly less popular of the two, which is N scale, and we're going to be going over the 3 positives first. So one of the big reasons for picking N scale for a lot of people actually is the size factor. A lot of us don't have room for a big expansive layout in the larger scales, and I'm including HO scale in that. So if we want to have a lot of long mainline runs and do a lot of things like that, you're going to pick N scale. And actually talking about mainline runs actually leads into my number 2 reason, which is mainline modeling is easier in N scale because of the space factor. So if you like using those big steamers and big diesel locomotives and running long trains, but you don't have a ton of space like an entire basement or something else, then you might want to consider N scale because you're going to be able to achieve that in less space. And again, the third benefit I'm going to talk about is also space related, which is you can get some pretty big scenes in N scale without compromising on a lot of things. So when you want to build those big expansive mountain scenes, those rock faces, those large gullies with bridges over them, things like that, it's a lot easier to do that in N scale because of the space factor. So if we're looking at overall the one big benefit of N scale, it's going to be that you can get a lot in a smaller space. All right, let's hop into the 3 reasons why you might want to avoid N scale. And the first one is going to be pretty similar to the reasons why that you would pick it, and that is the size. Now, I'm not talking about the size of the layout and the amount of track. I'm talking about the size of the actual locomotives and rolling stock and detail items. They get really, really small, and sometimes it gets very difficult to work with them. And that's one thing that might be a deterrent, especially if you want to have a bit more detail or if you want something that's easier to hold and is not quite as fragile. I'm not saying that N scale is incredibly fragile, but when you have something that small, it's going to be more fragile. So the size of N scale can be a drawback as well, which actually leads me into the second one, which is if you're looking to do small model railroad switching operations, yes, you can do them with N scale. I do them all the time, but they are certainly a lot more difficult with N scale. The biggest thing that I note specifically about switching operations with N scale is I have a tougher time doing the manual uncoupling in the way that I do it versus when I do manual uncoupling with HO scale. It's just more difficult, obviously, because the couplers are smaller and I derail cars more often when I'm trying to manually uncouple them. So small switching operations are not going to be the best in N scale. You can still certainly do them. I do them all the time, but you're going to have a better time with that. If you're doing a small switching railroad, you're going to have a better time with that with HO scale. And the third one I've kind of touched on already, which is you're going to have less opportunity for detail because of that size factor. If you really like detailing stuff and really getting into the nitty gritty and the minutia of making things look really, really good and putting all those little accents and details on it, you're going to have a harder time with that in N scale. And that goes back to the size factor. So basically, your 3 reasons are the size of the locomotives and the rolling stock. It's harder to do switching operations than with HO scale. And you're going to be limited on the amount of detail you can put compared to HO scale. So it really all ties back into the size factor, which is really what's going to be the difference between picking different scales. All right, let's talk about HO scale. And the first reason is that it is the most popular scale. HO scale and all of its variants are the most popular scale of model railroad in the world, hands down. That's not really a debate. There are a few places where different scales might be more popular, but overall, HO scale and its various variants on the track gauge are the most popular in the world. And I think part of the reason for that is my second reason, and I'm an N-scaler, so you can pretty much take this as something that's like an ultimate tip of the hat. And that's going to be that the size of HO scale, in my opinion, is absolutely perfect. It is small enough to where you can get it into smaller spaces without worrying about compromising too much. But it's also big enough to where you can get some detail and it's really fun to run. So the size of HO scale, in my opinion, is the perfect size of model railroad, which is why that it is the most popular in the world. And another great thing about it being the most popular in the world is you have the most variety of parts. What I mean by that is you have the most rolling stock, you have the most companies that make it, you have the most people that talk about it, you have the most everything with it. So when you're looking at HO scale, if you're looking for the biggest support community and you're looking for the biggest product base, HO scale is going to be the one that has that over N scale. So all right, so let's go into 3 reasons that you may not want to pick HO scale. And the first one is the obvious one. It's really what comes down to picking different scales. It's the space factor. You're going to be able to get less into it than you would with N scale. You're going to need more space to do the same thing that you do in N scale, and that's simply because of the size factor, and that's kind of an obvious one. But it's something to really consider when you're doing, when you're picking, if you're picking between these two scales, is like how much space you have, and you need to consider that. And are you going to be happy with less trackage with HO scale and the bigger size, or if you're going to be happy with more trackage and the smaller size with N scale? It's a big thing to consider. So that's one of the potential drawbacks, is the lack of space, or the space that you need to run it. So the second one is you're going to have more detail opportunities because of its size, but that also leaves it open to more scrutiny, and you're going to be able to see more of the flaws if you don't get something right. If something's going to bug you, it's more likely going to bug you on HO scale because you're going to be able to see it more pronounced, you're going to be able to see it easier, and you're going to be like, ugh. So now if you do it and you're happy with it, that's fine. I'm not talking about other people coming and looking at it, but if you get something wrong, it's going to be more obvious in HO scale when it comes to details and scenery and all that kind of stuff, and it may bug you a little bit more. The other thing, it comes back to space also, is that main lines are more difficult because typically you're not going to be able to model a main line in HO scale unless you have an entire room dedicated to it, or a section of a basement or things like that. Whereas in N scale, you can model it in the corner of a room and you can still get some decent mainline operations. You can have trains passing and things like that, so which I have actually done. So when you're looking at picking scales, if you want to do more mainline operations, HO scale may not be the best unless you have the space for it. So you may have sensed a recurring theme during this entire episode, and it's really going to be space. How much space you have and what size of train are you willing to work with. And that's really, in my opinion, the ultimate deciding factor in picking any scale with model railroading, depending on what you can work with, what you're willing to work with, all sorts of different things. So the size factor is overall the number one decider, in my opinion, of picking which scale you're going to work with. And it is a big decision between N and HO scale, because also once you commit to this, it's going to be a lot of money one way. And if you end up not liking it, it's going to be something that could be potentially very expensive to change to the different scale. I know, because I've done it. So when you're picking between these two, just do your research, figure out what you like best, maybe try to find a local club or things like that where you can see the different sizes and that kind of stuff, and figure out which one you really, really like. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let's take a look at some of the coffees that you guys were drinking. Buzzard42 says he's drinking Nicky Bean's 100% Kona Estate with half and half and saccharin. All right, that sounds absolutely delicious. Michael Pfister says he's drinking his Starbucks Sumatra. Always delicious. Love me Starbucks Sumatra. Forever DC302 says having Timmy's with just milk. That's Tim Hortons for anyone who doesn't know that. Andy Crawford says, try Ashanti Coffee Double Double. It's a local coffee from Collingwood, Ontario, Canada. So I'll definitely have to put that on my list. Brian Page Model Trains says that he is watching today with Black Rifle Coffee Company's Just Black, Just Black. So there you go. I do love me some Black Rifle Coffee Company. I've had several of theirs, so they are quite delicious. Maurice Grimes says that he is drinking Folgers 100% Colombian, and he says, stay safe all. So there we go, guys. Remember to tell me which scales that you guys really, really like and why you pick the scale that you do, even if it's not in or HO scale. I know it's what we talked about here, but go ahead and put that in the comments below. Also, tell me what coffees you're drinking. Put that in the comments below. So thank you guys so much for watching. I want to give a big thank you to all of my patrons. They're listed right here. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. Thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I am Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.